December 15th, 1944. Allied headquarters at Versailles was still operating under the same broad assessment it had carried through November. Germany was retreating. Fuel shortages had reduced German armor to limited operational mobility. Manpower losses across two fronts had degraded division strength below offensive capability in most sectors. The Wehrmacht that had swept through France in 1940 no longer existed in the same form. The assessment had not emerged from optimism alone. It was built from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, reconnaissance reports, and months of battlefield movement showing German forces giving ground faster than Berlin could stabilize its collapsing front. Allied planners had watched German lines bend repeatedly under pressure that earlier in the war might have shattered entire campaigns. Germany could still defend. It could delay. Local counterattacks remained possible. But a large winter offensive through the Ardennes required fuel, coordination, reserve strength, and operational mobility that Allied command increasingly believed Germany no longer possessed in sufficient quantity. The Ardennes sector itself had been designated a quiet zone. 4 American divisions held roughly 85 miles of front through dense forest and frozen ground that military geography had long considered unsuitable for large armored movement. 2 of the divisions were rebuilding after heavy casualties sustained earlier in the campaign. 2 others were newly arrived and still integrating into frontline operations. The sector existed partly to give exhausted formations time to recover. Nothing about the assignment appeared unusual. German radio traffic in the area had grown noticeably quieter through late November and into December. Aerial reconnaissance reported movement along forest roads east of the Ardennes, but worsening weather limited consistent observation. Some reports described engineer activity near river crossings. Others noted increased rail movement toward the region. Intelligence officers at First Army submitted assessments through November describing unusual patterns developing inside the sector. The reports referenced fragmented observations, vehicle sounds moving through forest roads after dark, patrol contacts increasing along previously quiet sectors, prisoner accounts mentioning unfamiliar unit designations appearing near the line. The assessments reached higher headquarters. They were reviewed alongside everything else arriving across the Western Front. And against the larger operational picture, Germany retreating, fuel depleted, divisions under strength, the Ardennes reports resembled defensive preparation more than offensive concentration. Possibly local reinforcement activity. Possibly limited counterattack planning. Nothing clearly consistent with a major winter offensive. The maps at Versailles still showed the Ardennes as a secondary sector. Staff officers planning future Allied operations were already focusing farther north toward the Rhine crossings. Outside, the weather had been deteriorating for days. Fog settled across the Ardennes forest each morning and rarely lifted fully before dark. The intelligence was arriving. It just was not arriving cleanly. First Army's G2 section, the intelligence staff, had been compiling reports from the Ardennes sector through late November and into the first weeks of December. Patrol contacts increased along sections of the front that had remained quiet for weeks. Forward positions reported vehicle movement east of the line after dark, engines moving through forest roads beyond reliable aerial visibility beneath persistent cloud cover. Prisoner interrogations added more fragments. A captured soldier from a unit previously unreported in the sector. Another describing relief operations intelligence had not fully tracked. Unfamiliar division markings appearing on equipment recovered near the line. None of the reports independently confirmed preparation for a major offensive. each arrived separately through different channels, summarized at different command levels, before reaching the officers responsible for building a coherent operational picture. Colonel Benjamin Dixon, First Army's intelligence chief, had been watching the accumulation closely. By early December, his assessments had moved beyond describing ordinary defensive preparation. On December 10th, Dixon's estimate used the word offensive. The report warned that Germany might attempt a major attack through the Ardennes before Allied momentum could fully recover from the autumn fighting. The estimate circulated. It did not significantly alter the broader assessment at higher headquarters. Part of the difficulty was that intelligence analysis along the Western Front had become saturated with fragmented reporting by late 1944. Officers processed enormous quantities of information daily, some accurate, some contradictory, some reflecting local conditions that never developed into larger operations. Determining which signals represented genuine offensive preparation and which reflected normal defensive activity required interpretation under incomplete conditions and constant time pressure. And the broader operational framework continued pulling interpretation in one direction. Schaef's intelligence picture through December still showed a German army struggling to replace losses faster than Allied pressure could inflict them. Fuel shortages remained severe. Rail movement across Germany faced repeated disruption from Allied bombing. Captured documents and prisoner accounts continued describing formations operating below expected strength. Ultra-intercepts, decoded German communications, had also failed to reveal clear evidence of a major offensive concentration inside the Ardennes. That absence mattered enormously. By late 1944, Allied analysts had grown deeply reliant on Ultra as one of the most effective indicators of German operational intention available anywhere in the war. What Ultra had not revealed was that German commanders preparing the Ardennes offensive had imposed unusually strict radio silence across formations assembling east of the forest. Orders moved by courier. Senior officers briefed subordinate commanders in person. Operational details were distributed through hand-carried instructions designed specifically to avoid the radio traffic patterns Allied intelligence had learned to monitor. The silence Allied analysts were reading as reduced operational activity was partially the product of deliberate concealment. But from Versailles, the distinction remained difficult to see clearly. Elsewhere across Allied command, the broader conclusions remained similar. Field Marshal Montgomery's intelligence staff at 21st Army Group saw no evidence suggesting Germany retained the capability for a major strategic offensive in the West. In Washington, assessments reaching the War Department reflected the same broad expectation that Germany's remaining operational flexibility was narrowing rapidly. Inside that environment, Dixon's Ardennes estimate existed as a minority interpretation against a much larger strategic consensus. Planning continued. Future Allied operations east of the Rhine still occupied far more attention at Versailles than the Ardennes sector holding exhausted American divisions through fog, snow, and frozen forest roads. And east of those forests, beneath weather conditions, Allied reconnaissance could no longer consistently penetrate. German formations that had spent weeks assembling in silence continued moving toward their final attack positions. The artillery began before dawn, not from one sector, from hundreds of positions simultaneously across an 85-mile front, stretching through the Ardennes forests. American units holding sectors that had remained relatively quiet for weeks absorbed the opening barrage before many commanders fully understood the scale of what was happening. Telephone lines were cut almost immediately. Radio operators attempting to reach battalion headquarters found frequencies already congested with overlapping traffic arriving from multiple sectors at once. Forward observers trying to identify firing positions could barely see beyond the fog and darkness covering the forest floor. The first reports arrived in fragments, heavy contact near one sector. Armor sounds farther east. Road movement behind the line, requests for artillery support from positions that had stopped responding minutes later. No single report explained the scale yet. Individual unit messages reached regimental headquarters describing pressure against isolated sectors of the line. Regimental reports reached division headquarters describing attacks, developing simultaneously across multiple positions. Division headquarters attempting to establish coherent communication with corps-level command found parts of the network already disrupted by destroyed lines, overloaded frequencies, and conflicting battlefield information arriving faster than staff officers could organize it. By the time a broader picture began forming at 1st Army headquarters, German infantry had already penetrated portions of the forward line, while armored formations were moving through gaps inside sectors that had been classified as relatively quiet less than 24 hours earlier. Colonel Benjamin Dixon was not present when the offensive began. He had left for Paris the previous evening on authorized leave. His December 10th estimate warning of possible offensive action through the Ardennes remained inside the files. At Versailles, the initial reaction was confusion before alarm. The scale did not immediately appear clear. Early assessments still described localized attacks intended to disrupt Allied planning elsewhere along the front, a spoiling operation. A temporary concentration designed to complicate movement before renewed Allied offensives farther north. The interpretive framework that had shaped German capability assessments for weeks did not disappear instantly because artillery had opened across the Ardennes. It bent first. Senior staff officers began comparing incoming reports against the operational estimates that had governed Allied planning through December. The numbers arriving from the front no longer aligned with what those estimates believed Germany capable of concentrating inside the sector. Not the artillery density, not the infantry commitment, not the armored movement now being reported through roads many Allied planners had considered unsuitable for major offensive operations in winter conditions. Eisenhower was at Versailles that morning, attending meetings unrelated to the Ardennes sector when the reports began arriving in larger volume. As the day progressed, the understanding shifted gradually from localized disruption toward something larger. By evening, command discussions that had avoided describing the attack as a major offensive earlier in the day were using the word openly. Orders moved quickly after that realization. The 7th Armored Division and 10th Armored Division were redirected toward the Ardennes before headquarters fully understood the scale of the German breakthrough developing inside the forest. The units began moving before many officers at Versailles knew precisely what conditions they were moving toward. East of the forest, German columns assembled through weeks of radio silence and courier-delivered orders were already advancing westward through roads Allied planners had assessed as operationally secondary. Some American formations directly in the path of the advance still believed they were confronting limited attacks rather than the opening stage of Germany's largest Western offensive since 1940. Supply depots behind the line had not been reorganized for a major defensive withdrawal. Fuel reserves German planners hoped to capture remained positioned farther forward than they might have been under a different assessment of German capability. In Bastogne, traffic was still moving normally through the road network that would become one of the central operational objectives of the offensive within days. Drivers continued passing through the town without knowing the roads east of them were already beginning to close. The Battle of the Bulge continued through January 1945. By the time Allied forces had pushed German formations back close to their original positions, the offensive had produced roughly 75,000 American casualties. German losses were severe enough that many of the formations committed to the Ardennes could no longer sustain meaningful offensive operations afterward. Strategically, the battle eventually confirmed much of what Allied command had believed during the autumn. Germany did not possess the industrial capacity, fuel reserves, or manpower necessary to sustain a prolonged war against combined Allied production. But the events of December 1944 exposed something different beneath that larger conclusion. The post-battle reviews forced intelligence officers and senior commanders to revisit assessments that had seemed reasonable only weeks earlier. Colonel Benjamin Dixon's December 10th estimate received renewed attention after the offensive. The language warning of possible German attack preparations inside the Ardennes looked different after December 16th than it had before. Officers who had previously interpreted the assessment as overly cautious were now reviewing the same document against a background of broken communications, collapsed defensive sectors, and reserve divisions committed into conditions far more severe than headquarters had anticipated. The estimate had not been hidden. It had not been ignored in the simple sense later retelling sometimes implied. It had been processed inside a larger intelligence framework that still viewed Germany as strategically exhausted and operationally constrained. That distinction mattered enormously to the officers responsible for making those assessments. It mattered less to the units that had absorbed the opening assault in the Ardennes. Eisenhower later described the offensive as a surprise, not because warning signs had been completely absent, but because the scale, coordination, and operational concentration exceeded what Allied command believed Germany still capable of executing in late 1944. That assessment was accurate. It was also the same interpretive framework that had caused fragmented warnings arriving from the Ardennes to appear less dangerous before the attack began. The confidence built through months of Allied advance had gradually shaped how incoming intelligence was interpreted. Reports that aligned with the broader expectation of German collapse reinforced existing assumptions. Signals that contradicted those assumptions required stronger evidence before they altered the larger operational picture. The Ardennes warnings contradicted it. And because they arrived fragmented rather than unified, they never fully displaced the framework already governing Allied expectations. After the battle, Allied intelligence procedures underwent review. Assessment methods were examined more closely. Reporting channels were reconsidered. Greater attention was placed on how fragmented intelligence might accumulate into operational warning even when no single report appeared decisive independently. The relationship between ultra-intercepts and other intelligence sources also received renewed scrutiny after German radio silence had concealed preparations that normal signal analysis failed to detect clearly. The procedures improved afterward. They improved because the cost of December had made the weaknesses visible in ways earlier warnings had not. Across the Ardennes, the physical evidence of the offensive remained visible long after the fighting ended. Roads cut apart by tracked movement and artillery fire. Abandoned vehicles frozen beside forest trails. Defensive positions that had changed hands repeatedly through December and January before becoming quiet again beneath snow and mud. Supply traffic eventually resumed through many of the same routes German armor had used during the offensive. The maps at Versailles had also been updated. The assumptions that shaped them before December 16th were harder to see in the revised versions afterward. But they had been there, and for several weeks in the winter of 1944. The gap between what Allied command believed Germany capable of doing and what German forces were actually preparing inside the Ardennes forest had widened slowly enough that it remained difficult to recognize clearly, until the artillery began firing before dawn on December the 16th.